Welcome to Journalist Roundtable. I'm Corey Clark in Philadelphia, and joining us this week are R.B. Swift in our Camp Hill studio from Capitolwire, Stephen Caruso joining us remotely from Spotlight, PA, and also remotely from the Pennsylvania Capital Star, John Cole. John, we'll start with you. You were with the Lieutenant Governor earlier this week, and he was talking about obviously the budget and more specifically transportation funding and trying to set that part of the budget up for the next 5 years. Can you talk about what he was touting in Bucks this week?
That's correct. And first off, again, thanks for having me on the program, Corey. It's always great to be here on PCN's Journalist Roundtable. So on Tuesday, Lieutenant Governor Austin Davis was in Bucks County, specifically Croydon. He was leading a press conference at a regional rail station to emphasize the importance of passing a bill to fund mass transit. As of late, SEPTA, over the past year or so, I think it's fair to say SEPTA, which is the biggest mass transit agency which serves Southeast Pennsylvania, has been sounding the alarm about essentially a massive budget deficit. I think it was $213 million to be exact is what they were facing. And to essentially make up for that, SEPTA said if there's not an increase in funding and a bill passed, they would need to increase fares, cut services. And one of the rails lines that they were actually talking about cutting would have been the Trenton line, which the Croydon station services into Philadelphia. So Lieutenant Governor Davis and some transit advocates, as well as some elected officials like State Senator Steve Santicero and a few others, spoke about the importance of getting a bill across the finish line to fund mass transit. I don't want to speak on behalf of RB or Stephen, but I think it's fair to say this budget cycle, mass transit funding has kind of emerged as the big topic of this conversation. This is not the first time we're hearing about it. And it's actually an issue, interestingly enough, even though Democrats have talked about it by and large, you do have some Republicans, particularly in Southeast Pennsylvania, State Representative Martina White, State Senator Joe Picozzi, State Senator Frank Farrer. There's a few others that have gone to talk about their support for SEPTA and the need to get something done. I guess the question is, what kind of mass transit package and funding package would get through. On Tuesday, when Lieutenant Governor Davis was there, and again, he's a son of a union bus driver from Pittsburgh, he talked about the need to get this done. Later that day, the State House passed a bill that would increase public transportation funding, as pairing it with increased funding for roads and bridges. That was led by State Representative Ed Nielsen, who is the chair of the House Transportation Committee, a Northeast Philadelphia Democrat. And essentially, the first hurdle was clear that it did pass the House. Most Democrats voted in support. The only two who did not vote in support were State Representative Frank Burns out in Cambria County, I believe, and then State Representative Tyra Probst. Having said that, though, even though the Democrats have a one-seat majority, this bill still passed because several Republicans voted in support of it. I mentioned State Representative Martina White. I think State Representative Joe Hogan in Bucks County, as well as Casey Tomlinson. There's a few others as well. But the point being, I think there was like 6 or 7 Republicans that jumped on board. So that is now cleared the House. And I guess the question is, what will the Senate do with it? But I think that is the big question going into next week, because this past week, the Senate was not in session. Next week, as we have I guess it's the last final full week before in budget negotiations, in the month at least, I should say, the House and Senate will both be in. I'm curious to see what the Senate is going to do with this bill, because it's pretty clear that there are Republicans in leadership that are skeptical about funding mass transit, because they certainly believe they don't think it's benefiting the whole state necessarily. I'm sure others can kind of jump on that with the latest news there with comments from Majority Leader Joe Pittman and others.
Speaking of the Senate, Stephen, you were with Senator Pittman as well earlier this week. What did he have to say about the transportation funding, and is this bipartisan nature that happened in the House? What are the prospects of that happening on the Senate side?
Yeah, so Senate Majority Leader Joe Pittman spoke to reporters for about 45 minutes yesterday, and laid out a bunch of updates on the budget. But one of the most important to say too is that he said he didn't think it was going to be an on-time budget. June 30th is the statutory deadline. He thought they were going to take until mid-July. In some ways, this is almost a new normal in Harrisburg. There hasn't been an on-time budget since I believe 2021. At this point, most of them have been fashionably late, except for 2023, but. On the transit question, Pittman said on the House bill, he said he was happy to see the inclusion of road funding. There's about $500 million in bonding included in the Nielsen bill. He thought that was a good sign because he's been pretty emphatic that for the Senate Republican caucus, which is made up of lawmakers mostly from rural and some suburban areas with a handful of exceptions, road funding is key. Not every county has people who regularly commute with mass transit, though there is transit in every single county. So for Pittman, road funding is important, but he also said that he didn't think that the spending numbers that House Democrats were including, which is it would be about $300 million in its first year of sales tax revenue that would go directly to transit, was sustainable. That's kind of been his watchword for this budget. I'd say Senate Republicans' budget. The state faces a structural deficit. Governor Shapiro's plan requires using about $4 to $5 billion in surplus revenue built up over the last couple of years to balance itself. It's a $50 billion or so spending plan, maybe 51. That's a lot of money that the state doesn't have, or has this year, but continuing that means the state would either need more revenue or cut costs somewhere else. So all of this is to say, Pittman was not a huge fan of the spending number, but that is the number that transit agencies say they need to avoid deep cuts from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh to even rural agencies or smaller cities like Allentown, Scranton, Harrisburg, etc. In fact, Pittman said that he'd be comfortable leaving Harrisburg without funding transit, at least his caucus. Granted, that might not be great news if you're a lawmaker who has stepped in his district, but I think there's also what we're seeing is a little bit of positioning. I think we're seeing a little bit of brinksmanship. That's to be expected is budget season. It's early, especially with Pittman saying that we're not going to hit the June 30th deadline. The Harrisburg's kind of comfort with just admitting that a week before is certainly another conversation to have. But that's where we're at right now, and I think that a lot's going to be on private conversations between the top lawmakers and their top staff to see what comes out of the coming weeks.
RB, you wrote about the roads and bridges aspect as well, and that there has to be some borrowing in order to fund what they want to do.
Yes, the bill passed by the House would authorize up to $500 million in bonds for road and bridge projects, picked by PennDOT over 4 years. And they even would use a portion of sales tax revenue to service the $40 million estimated annual debt on those bonds. Under the bill, the Commonwealth Financing Authority would handle the matter. That's significant because that's an agency where the 4 legislative members of a 7-member board have to all agree for anything to pass. So it's a legislative supermajority. So it gives the 4 caucuses big say in what projects are selected. And virtually now for the past 20 years, since the authority was formed, it's taken on new borrowing for stuff almost every year. Clean water's in there, energy, and now they want to do the roads and bridges. Now, this caught my eye because this $500 million is somewhat significant. But when I was a young reporter back in the 70s, PennDOT was in a real mess. And one of the reasons was because they were borrowing for roads and bridges with no backup source to pay off the interest. And it had reached a point by the late 70s where 25% of PennDOT revenues were going to pay the interest on debt. And then in the 70s, we had the energy crisis and with energy conservation, 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, the money from the taxes, the gas tax was down. So when they finally were able to straighten the mess out with some new revenue sources. You have not seen much borrowing in the last 50 years, some more limited amount. So if they do this, this would be, to me, a significant step. Once again, the same bill includes a provision to create a new Transportation Funding Commission. It would be about the third in the last maybe 15 years, because they're acknowledging that the 500 million is just a short-term deal, and it's not going to meet the need. So this commission would have a mandate next year to come up with more funding recommendations. Normally when they do these transportation packages, they like to have them last for a while. The last one was done in 2013, and the one before that was 2007. So if they do lawmakers don't like to have to do this so many years. So that's one of another big issues that's going to be they have to deal with in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, to build off what RD said, I mean, to build off what RD said, I think that's a really important thing to note, is that Leader Pittman even noted, I think transportation's issue is what he says, but when I ask people how to pay for it, it's deer in the headlights. And, for instance, the 2013 Transportation Law Act 89, that was funded with, that included a gas tax hike. And there are lawmakers who lost their seat in primaries because of that gas tax hike, or faced primaries because of it. And that was 10 years ago, or more than that. So it's always politically tricky, and at a time when I think Republicans are already concerned about spending, like the specter of spending more money on transportation, particularly mass transit, which they don't see as serving their districts, is politically difficult. Let alone the policy itself. But changes need to be made. Bob Latham, the head of the Highway Constructors Lobby, he noted that just one of the biggest problems in the rise of hybrids and fuel-efficient cars is gas tax revenue is going down, but there are still just as many cars on the road. And that is, that means that you can't get as much bang for your buck to replace roads and bridges. Pittman did say he's open to some debt, specifically to replace roads yesterday, or not roads, replace bridges yesterday, but I think even then that might be a smaller universe than what even the highway constructors or the House Democrats passed. So this needs to be a long-term conversation, and right now Harrisburg has frankly struggled to have long-term big deal conversations that can kind of fix things for a decade. And but it's a challenge right in front of us. Without it, roads are going to keep crumbling, and transit agencies say they're going to face deep cuts.
How much is the federal part of this affecting the Pennsylvania budget process? That we're in the first year of a new administration, and they've been making cuts. How much of that is dependent upon what we can do with the Pennsylvania budget?
Well, I'll answer that. Right now, the Republicans don't seem to want to talk about it, act like it doesn't exist. The Democrats are calling attention to certain areas of potential impacts of cut to Medicaid. There's a whole slew of programs that are been frozen that the state relies on. I don't think even Governor Shapiro has really fully addressed it. The problem is that the federal bill has not passed yet. And there's talk in Washington of trying to do it by July 4th. And it's uncertain whether that will happen. And until that happens, it's hard for state lawmakers to really try to adjust. I think the state gets about $50 billion in federal aid every year. So we're talking about a huge amount of money. And it is right now, it's hard for, I think it's unfortunate that the timing of these two things is occurring as they are. And that may be one reason why Pittman's saying he doesn't think it's going to happen on June 30th.
I'd like to add one thing that I think somewhat ties into this conversation too, is that we've seen a discussion, I believe it was last week, was it? Senate President Kim Ward had a comment that said that she was open to a short-term, like a stopgap budget to get, I guess essentially to wait to see what happens with the federal government. Having said that, though, even though Kim Ward had those comments, and Stephen, I'm not sure if Pittman also endorsed that potential plan too. However, Democrats in leadership positions are not on board with a stopgap budget. We saw House Majority Appropriations Chairman Jordan Harris say that he was not in favor of that. And I can actually tell you on Tuesday when I saw Lieutenant Governor Davis, I asked him specifically about Senator Ward's comments about being open to a short-term budget, and he essentially reiterated the point that Majority Appropriations Chairman Harris said that again they want to get a budget for the full year. But that's another interesting conversation I think we should see moving forward. Is that there's some Republicans in leadership positions that have said that they're open to a short-term budget due to what's going on with the federal funding, but some Democrats are essentially shooting that idea down right now.
Well, and I don't even think it's partisan. As you noted, John, Pittman actually was not a big fan of the idea. I mean, he didn't totally trash it, but he said, my goal is to get a full year done and move on to other things. I think the back and forth about short-term versus long-term is just as much politics as policy. I think it's a lot about, when do you have more leverage? When do you want to be cutting the hard deals? The argument for the full year budget is, I would say, a mix of what Pittman and Democrats have said, which is just get it out of the way, provide certainty. You don't want to drag this thing out. Dragging it out means that, maybe you can, try to ride the uncertainty of what the federal government's going to do, but it's not like the hard choices go away. The last time Pennsylvania did a half budget, as far as I can tell, was 2020 during the pandemic. I think there was a little more just awareness that this is unprecedented times then. It was bipartisan. Also, it was Governor Tom Wolf, a Democrat, and a totally Republican General Assembly. I think that made it easier to just, have everyone just say, guys, let's just do this quick and easy and come back in fall when we actually know what's going on with, lockdowns and everything. This year, there's definitely there's the federal uncertainty. It's not a pandemic. It's not a massive volcano eruption. It is truly the political nature of what is government's role, how much spending should occur. It's more an ideological fight. It's not the state trying to respond to, like I said, a natural disaster. So, but it's just worth noting, Leader Pittman, who is the titular negotiator for Senate Republicans, has said he's open to it. He didn't take it off the table, but he said his goal, negotiate a full year and get it done.
RB, how does this Shapiro administration compare to some other recent governors when it comes to getting a budget done on time, or at least in a timely fashion?
Well, I mean, the significant fact is that this is a non-election year. So when you have a non-election year in Harrisburg, you're more likely not to blow the deadline. And that's been for a long time now. But even in recent years, election years used to be they'd get the thing done, but last year was an election year. They went to mid-July, so that started to fade as a marker for them because they don't get a lot of public reaction to what they're doing. The other thing that I've seen over the years is just a much more secretive process than it ever was before, and by that I mean in June you used to have the chambers put out budget bills and even vote on them. And that would be done sometimes in early June. Wouldn't be the final bill, but you'd sort of see what was out there. I remember in 2009, certainly a bad year. The Republican-controlled Senate passed the budget, and then Governor Rendell spent 3 weeks, tearing it apart publicly. So Shapiro, obviously in the first year, 2023, when it didn't get everything resolved until December, was falling into the line of the bad, budget years. After they did get a basic budget done last year, the second year, mid-July is now seen as it's almost like the new normal. We're not in a crisis yet because we got it done by mid-July. Obviously, we are not in a situation where we used to be, where state workers weren't getting paid. That due to court opinions that ended, and that was one reason that's led to everyone not so worried about June 30th anymore.
Yeah, I think that's
Stephen,
an important thing to note is well, the state has the missing the deadline doesn't matter as much as RB said because of that court ruling, which state workers are going to get paid no matter what. But even then, you don't see a trickle down because all the fiscal years aren't aligned. Like if the state stops making some payments in June, it might not really start to hit, agencies until, or local agencies, school districts, until like September, October, November. So that's like kind of built in an extra like period where it just creates more uncertainty, more times for brinksmanship. And I think we've really seen that happen the last couple of years. And I've also just kind of heard from, Democrats will, or whatever side on the equation, will just say it's better for us to cut a good deal than take a bad deal just because of this deadline that we've now kind of repeatedly moved past with limited consequences. Again, once you get to August, September, October, school districts start to be concerned. Libraries, counties, human service providers, all of them will start to feel a pinch. But it seems as if like deadlines have just kind of shifted into July, and for better or for worse.
Stephen, you mentioned school districts. Talk about the education part of this that's sort of hanging over this process is the Commonwealth Court ruling on school funding equity. The legislators have to keep that in mind, right, when they talk about education funding?
Well, I'd say that's even increasingly become partisan. Democrats certainly have it in mind. They've been pushing for more money to go into education every year to meet that obligation. Particularly, they want to close what is called the adequacy gap. It's effectively the idea of this is the gap between how much it takes to educate an average student who's just, comes from a average income family in an average district versus, how much extra money does it take to educate a kid who comes from a more low-income family who maybe isn't a first, it doesn't speak English at home. Maybe they have a special need. And adequacy was Democrats' way of trying to get at that notion that poor districts were underfunded and weren't able to meet their needs. They want to consistently be putting, about $500 million in every year or so for the next 5, 6, 7 years to try and bridge that gap. But again, that requires consistent investment that builds on itself. We're not just talking about it's $500 million and it compounds. You need to keep adding that. That requires recurring revenue that right now the state does not have. So again, it becomes a partisan issue with Republicans who are really trying to dig in on spending this year. They've okayed spending increases in the past. This year, it seems like it's really become more of a high-key political issue for them. And what that means is, Republicans say we need to find ways to slow spending. They've mentioned in education, and obviously one thing that comes up is school vouchers, something they continue to push. They almost got in 2023, but that blew up the budget that year. And now, so I think what we're going to see, Joe Pittman has said, it's important to know adequacy has been House Democrats' way of trying to put a dollar amount on that ruling from 2023 that said this poor school districts were underfunded. The ruling itself does not have a number attached. Other states have had these rulings, and I don't believe many of them have put a number attached. The ruling, in fact, specifically says the solutions are nearly endless, which is why you see Republicans try to point to, with enrollment declining in public schools, with Pennsylvania's population getting increasingly older, with more, is more money the solution? It's going to vary district by district because this is a very diverse state. You have districts with schools that were built during the Civil War. You have districts that, have also probably, hundreds less students than they did even 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's complicated trying to find the right solution, but I think a lot of it is always going to come down to, how do you spend money in a way that doesn't create a deficit? Because unlike the federal government, Pennsylvania can't go into debt to fund spending on a year-by-year basis.
I want to give you guys a chance to talk about some other things that you've written about outside of the budget. And John, you wrote about the moment of silence that the House held for the Minnesota lawmaker who was assassinated. And that brings another issue to the forefront, specifically security for elected officials or those who are running for office, right?
That's correct. Well, again, so that was Monday of this week. You had leaders in both parties. You had Speaker McClinton, you had the Democratic leader, Matt Bradford, and then also Jesse Topper, the Republican leader, all deliver remarks on the floor of the House, essentially, offering, their thoughts and prayers to the people in Minnesota, those impacted by the tragedy that happened there this past weekend. And they made a point to certainly, again, condemn any sort of political violence And to your point about security, State Representative Malcolm Kenyatta, I believe it was later on Monday, authored a co-sponsorship memo that he believes, to try to essentially assist, helping security details of a different way to pay for security details for these elected officials. So again, that's something where I think we don't have all the details there on that Representative Kenyatta's proposal, but I'm curious to see how that develops.
RB, this is sort of an interesting article you wrote about whole milk in schools.
Yes, this is a bill that passed the House Committee, Agriculture Committee, this week, and it basically would allow schools to buy whole milk from Pennsylvania farmers, dairy members, and is seeking to get around a federal directive going back to 2010 that schools have to provide skim milk as a more healthy alternative. And the sponsor of the bill, Representative John Lawrence, has said that kids don't like skim milk and they're throwing it away. And the dairy industry wants this legislation because they are concerned about having, obviously, sources for their members' milk supplies. And so, they also want to encourage young people to be drinking milk so they have customers. So if you're turning kids off to milk because they don't like skim milk, they're concerned about that. Now, this bill's been around a couple of times, but what may change is that also in Congress, there are similar bills in this Republican-controlled Congress to do the same thing, and which makes me believe that this year this may actually be happening. But once again, the state has really elevated the importance of the dairy industry in recent years with the Pennsylvania Farm Bill of a few years back, trying to promote innovation in dairy processing. So this bill fits in with this newfound emphasis on Pennsylvania dairy producers as part of the economy.
I just want to add one point I think is kind of interesting on that conversation from the federal level.
Real quick.
Because you have the chair of the House Agriculture Committee, G.T. Thompson, who is a Republican and from Pennsylvania. And then John Fetterman's a senator who serves on the Agriculture Committee, who I think is also a voice of support for this particular type of legislation. That's kind of an interesting Pennsylvania angle as well from the federal level.
And Stephen, real quick, the popularity of these weight loss drugs or these GLP-1s, which were initially for diabetes patients, but have become super popular as weight loss aids. And there's been some movement because of the popularity, the funding for it, they have to take a look at that.
Yeah, this is something that Governor Shapiro included in his budget address, was requiring higher conditions for folks to get prior authorization to take these drugs for weight loss. You have to have a high BMI or slightly lower, but still high BMI, along with a pre-existing condition such as like diabetes or heart disease, high blood pressure. This, like I said, this was a proposal from the Shapiro administration. They could implement it unilaterally under their authority under Medicaid, which is a split, provides a low-income health care, is split between the state and the federal government for its funding and control. But that is that move has been somewhat opposed by a few lawmakers who say that the long-term benefit of people losing weight will outweigh the immediate costs of these drugs. Because still, if someone's overweight, right now down the line they can develop worse and worse health complications. So there's been proposals to try and have DHS negotiate a better price. I should say DHS is able to get some rebates, but I think they just want to see a more determined effort. Other states and health insurance companies across the country are dealing with this, and it's it's another one of those issues that brings to light just Pennsylvania's general financial and fiscal uncertainty. This was an attempt by Shapiro to cut costs. Senate Republicans have said that Medicaid is something they really want to see costs go down in, and this is a way to do it. But again, everything the budgeting process is a little bit like squeezing on a balloon. You push a little on one end to try and get the air, and just blows up in another area. And that is the fundamental dynamic that lawmakers will have to tackle in the coming weeks.
All right, we're going to have to end it right there. I want to thank our guest, R.B. Swift from Capitolwire, Stephen Caruso from Spotlight PA, and John Cole from the Pennsylvania Capital Star. And thank you for watching Journalists Roundtable. Happy Juneteenth. I'm Corey Clark. Good night.